So today we're going to start a new sermon series, and this is exciting because we're leading up to Easter. Easter is about 6 Sundays out, so this is one of 5 Sundays before that. Now, we're not doing a traditional Lent service, but we want to look to the cross, we want to look to Easter, and in light of that, we want to ask some questions. I think that we all want to have a life of purpose. We all want to have a life of meaning. We all want to have a life of value. And those are good. And I think Jesus agrees with us. He wants the same things for us, but oftentimes he doesn't do it in the most popular ways to our culture. You see, our culture says that a life worth living is often one where we consume, we gain, and we hold on to. And Jesus, he says a life worth living is when you let go, when you give up, and when you release. So this sermon series, looking to Easter, is called A Life Worth Living. We look to Easter, and this is really, we're looking at Jesus' greatest demonstration of this, that his suffering and his sacrifice at the cross is actually what demonstrates this life and then invites us into. Now, some of the ways that he communicates to us, that he invites us into this, would be ways in which he asks us to follow him. That if we call ourselves believers, if we call ourselves Christians, we call ourselves followers of Jesus, there's things that he's asking us to give up. Now, in kind of this countercultural way of living, we believe that this is where we find a life worth living. So for this series, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look over a specific chunk of Scripture found in the book of Luke. And what's going on here, chapters 9 to 19, that Jesus and his growing disciples, or his students or followers, are on a road to Jerusalem. So what's being documented are these different accounts at which he is teaching, which he is living, which he is telling his disciples how to live, which he is correcting some of the religious leaders. I mean, there's so much going on in this time. We're going to pick just 5 of the accounts from these chapters 9 to 19 on the way to Jerusalem. And in each of these stories, we believe that Jesus is calling us to give something up, that in order to gain something, and here is where we find a life worth living. 2 days ago, Friday, we got to participate with Heaton Elementary on a couple of events. In the morning, we had what was called Read Across America. It's something that obviously, like its name, happens all the way across America, and schools participate in that. And then we also got to do some garden work here on campus. There's an organization called Learning Gardens, and they actually invited the kids and some teachers, and we just jumped on board to participate. So about 30 people, 30 adults from the community participated in Read America, and we got the chance to read to students in their classrooms throughout the morning. I got assigned to 2 6th grade classrooms, that age where they're way too cool to participate and act like they like you there, but deep down inside, they are just thrilled that you're there and they're just trying to hold everything back. And my book was called Making Friends is an Art. And this book is about a brown pencil, and he's a colored pencil inside of a colored pencil box, and he starts to look around him and he starts asking the questions of, why am I taller? And essentially what's happening is he's realizing that he's not getting used as much, that he's actually not getting to play with the other colored pencils. And there's others that are shorter than him. There's even a red one that's really stubby because she gets used all the time. She's the most fun pencil. And then there's others that have these other qualities inside of them that he starts to admire and he starts to want. So he goes on this journey and he starts asking, why do people not like me? He frowns a lot. He doesn't get along with others. He puts others down. And in this journey, they start to tell him that, hey, if you want to have friends, you need to be a good friend first. And then he starts to find out the qualities that he's admiring. Some of the other pencils encourage him that brown is actually the greatest color because when you put all of the colors together, it's the brown colored pencil. So he starts to find these things within him that he then realizes that he actually has purpose. And he starts living his purpose out in a way which he doesn't think. He thinks his purpose is to get used a lot and get sharp and to be the funnest one. But he starts to realize that he has all these qualities inside of him. And what he starts to do is he starts to use this purpose for the other colored pencils in the box. Now, this analogy starts to break down a little bit, but I think it is something that is not too far from all of our lives. I think we can lead a pretty common life to the brown-colored pencil. See, the challenge with finding a life worth living is that so often we try to find our purpose in comparison, in achievement, and in status. That once I get the right job, I can then live with purpose. That once I make enough money, I can then live with purpose. That once my circumstances aren't so challenging, I can then live with purpose. That I can then live with purpose when I have all of the right things. And this goes on and on and on. And this is the story that I think our culture is telling us. That once we get there, once we've reached a certain point, then I can live with purpose. And only then am I living a life worth living. I think Jesus actually asks us to let this go. I think he actually asks us to die to this thought that we have to get to a certain point to live a life of purpose. That until we get there, our current circumstances are only serving us to get to that next circumstance. So if we want a life of purpose, how do we find it today? Even if we don't feel like we've arrived, even if we don't feel like we've made it, even if we don't feel like we're good enough. See, I believe that our purpose is found in our proximity. And that's what I want us to walk away with today, is that our purpose is found in our proximity. Now, one of the first stories in this account of Luke, when Jesus and his disciples are on the road to Jerusalem, which Luke is really telling this account that he's comparing this road to faith, that we actually learn on the way, that as we're on this journey, we are learning more and more what it is like to follow and become like Jesus. And one of the first accounts is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm sure we've all heard this. I mean, there's hospitals, there's a law, people are deemed as Good Samaritan. I mean, Good Samaritan is a very common phrase in our culture. It's an idiom. But Jesus does a few things here that I don't want us to ever overlook. And he redefines who our neighbor is. He defines what our purpose is. And he reveals how we actually live out our purpose. So we're going to start off in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. This is one of the four accounts of just the documentary on Jesus here. So starting off, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. An expert of the law, think attorney, lawyer. And he said, "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" We can keep going. "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" Basically saying like, hey, you're the expert, man. What would you say about this? And the expert of the law answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus goes on and he says, you've replied correctly. So next slide. "Do this and you will live." The answer that you just gave, to love God and then to love your neighbor, do this and you will live. You will have eternal life. And then it goes on. The expert of the law says, "And who is my neighbor?" He wanted to find justification in this. Now, in our first century America, this phrase of neighbor is very common for us. But I want us to pause and just think real quick. When you think of neighbor, when you define neighbor, is it literal or is it figurative? Is it those that are similar to you? Is it those that are different? Does it end somewhere, either geographically or culturally, or maybe politically or religiously? What lines actually start to become drawn for you when you hear the word neighbor? And again, in our culture, neighbor is just another word. We all understand in so many ways what a neighbor is and what it could mean, but we probably have different definitions. Now, 2,000 years ago, it was very, very different. So what's going on here is that when the expert of the law is asking this, and he's saying, who is my neighbor? In that first century, Jewish tradition is that they would know the first 5 books of what we now call our Old Testament, that they were experts in the law, that they grew up studying this, that they could actually recite it, they knew it by memory. And there was a scripture all the way back in the book of Leviticus, the laws that were given to Moses for the people, and it talked about not holding a grudge against your people and loving your neighbor as yourself. So in Jewish culture, your neighbor was another Jew. Your neighbor was the person within your tribe. It was your people. It's who you get along with. It's who you're like. And this is what Jews knew. And I think what's happening here when he says that he wants to justify himself, so he asks, who is your neighbor? I think, first of all, he's probably asking, what's the least amount I need to do to love my neighbor? I think that's really what's going on here. But what I think happening is that he's actually uncomfortable with this answer. Because the experts of the law are starting to catch Jesus talking about this whole new idea of neighboring. And they're starting to see him actually live out neighboring in a much different way, that as a modern day Jew, he was breaking all of the cultural norms. And I think he's uncomfortable, like, well, love my neighbor. And he's trying to justify himself because he knows what neighbor is, but Jesus is starting to stretch him a little bit, and he doesn't really know what to do with it. So, I want to take a test, because we can look back at this and we can think, Jesus showed it to him and he ended up figuring it out, and it's different culturally, and we don't really deal with those same things anymore. We're all neighbors, and we don't have things inside of us that draw lines of where we start and stop neighboring. So I want to do a test, and I'm going to ask you a question, and I want to give you 10, 15 seconds to think about it. You don't need to say anything out loud. You don't need to respond. You don't need to raise your hand. But just think of a few answers. There's no right or wrong, but just take a few minutes, a few seconds, and just think about it. The question: in 2001, when terrorist attacks hit America in a number of spots, what were the ways in which we could have responded? Just think of a few answers. Now, again, don't need to give your answer, don't need to share anything. As you maybe thought of just a few answers, I just want you to think real quick. When you heard that question and you started thinking of your answers, did you answer from the perspective of an American citizen, or did you answer from the perspective of a follower of Jesus? Just think about that for a second. I had a professor ask our class this last semester, and it rocked me. Because, see, I answered from the perspective of the American citizen. And that's not to guilt or to shame. I think most of us in this room probably answered that way as with our class. And again, not to guilt or shame, but what I would propose is that our cultural perspective of neighbor is probably influencing us a little bit more than we would like to think. And that leaks into so many things. So I would like to think, I don't know if I'd like this because it's uncomfortable, but Jesus is pressing against the same buttons for this expert of the law as he is with us today. Us with an American culture, us as a Christian nation. I think Jesus' way of neighboring makes us highly uncomfortable because of the cultural norms that we are swimming in. So just something to consider. Now, let's continue. We go on here. Where are we at? So here's the deal. This is just brilliant. This is Jesus. The guy wants a justification on who my neighbor is, and like Jesus does a lot, he doesn't answer him. I think in the New Testament, Jesus literally answers like a few questions, a few things, and the rest he just proposes another question. But in Jesus said, he goes on to tell a story now. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side of the road. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side of the road. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, he came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now, for you, your translation, it could be pity, it could be mercy, but really that's translated as compassion, to suffer with. Let's continue. He went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Jesus is getting after it here. Like this is just slamming everything in the face of this expert of the law and most of those that were sitting around. It wasn't just a conversation with those two. There was others around. There were his disciples. There were other experts of the law. There were a lot of people listening into this of the Jewish culture. And what he did here is he pinned a Levite and a priest against a Samaritan. A Levite and a priest were seen as the righteous, as the leaders, as the holy people of the Jewish community. A Samaritan was seen as an enemy of the Jewish community. And we can't even do justice to what was going on. I mean, this is like institutionalized racism. This is apartheid, what was going on here. Samaritans were seen as half-breeds. They were seen lower than dogs by the Jews. War and so many other things that play into this. But he just took the leaders of the Jewish community and he pinned them against and actually put them below this Samaritan man. Ones that Jews absolutely hated. They would not be caught dead talking to one, let alone touching one. Jesus is getting after it here. Now, here's what stood out to me. Andre, I can't remember if I put it up on the next slide, but I want to go back to that Jerusalem to Jericho. Perfect. So this right here, this is about a 17-mile journey. It's a road that's pretty well traveled, and people would have reason of why they're going from Jerusalem to Jericho or vice versa. But it's about 17 miles, and it's a major elevation change. But what would happen oftentimes, it's through the mountains, so there's these spots to hide out. People would get beaten up and robbed. And oftentimes it was the Samaritans jumping and robbing and stealing from the Jews. But for us, if we think today, I don't oftentimes find myself walking 17 miles in general, especially in like a dangerous road. So we don't necessarily have the context in which this is happening, but I want you to think about the context in which you frequently travel. So I want you to think about your neighborhood. I want you to think about your workplace. I want you to think about where you do your leisure activities, where you go to dinner, where you go to vacation. And just take a minute and just reflect on those. Actually take it in. What's your neighborhood look like? What's your workplace look like? What things come to mind when you think of each of these places? Who comes to mind? What faces do you see in each of these? What are the areas that we frequently travel? Now, the other part of this is I don't think in my entire life I've come across someone naked, beaten, and robbed on the side of the road. I thought about this. I thought about how close I've been to it. But this isn't something that we come across very often in our society, in our culture. Not to say that it obviously it doesn't happen, but because it does. So, though we may never come across that, where you frequently travel, what needs are present? So When you think about your neighborhood, you think about your workplace, you think about the places that you go, what needs are there? May not be a man on the side of the road, but I guarantee you there are needs. What needs do people have? How are the marriages in your neighborhood? How's the emotional and the social health of your coworkers? Who are the people in your life that seem to be looking for attention? You see, the Samaritan realized something here that the priest and the Levite failed to. God may have placed them into the path of the beaten man for a purpose. Or better yet, God may have placed the beaten man in their path for a purpose. And it seems that the Samaritan man got this. That on his journey, where he was headed, which we don't know what he was doing. We have no idea why he was going there. We don't know if he frequently did this, but obviously you don't go 17 miles for no purpose. He wasn't leisurely strolling. He didn't have all the time in the world to stop. He was doing something. He was busy. He had a destination. He had a purpose for his journey that was different than the purpose that he ended up living out here. So what about you? Do you believe that whatever circumstances are going on in your life, that God has in your life for a purpose? That whether you're satisfied with your job or not, that whether you would like to live in a different neighborhood, whether you feel like you have arrived or not, do you feel like this present moment is a moment of purpose for you? That you are living a life worth living? See, here at Midtown, when we say that our mission is to be spirit-dependent, other-centered, this is essentially what we're talking about. That we believe that in all things, in everything that we do, we can actually rely on the Spirit of God for what we're doing. And what happens when we become dependent on God's Spirit is that we start to see others. That we become other-centered in everything that we do. So, the Samaritan man's proximity led to his purpose. He saw the need and he walked up to it. But he didn't stop there. Let's go to that next slide. This is Jesus just continues just to turn the dagger here. Where are we at? Let's go back. I think I had one in there. Is there one in there that just highlighted the next day and when I return? Perfect. So check this out. The Samaritan man does not just stop, do the bandages, drop them off at the inn. The next day, he stayed overnight with this Jewish man. Not only did they not talk, did they not touch each other, did they not hang out, dude hung out with the guy overnight to continue tending to him. And then, look after him, he said, when I return. He's not done. He's actually living out compassion. He's doing more than just stopping and throwing the dude a sandwich. He's spending time with him. He is suffering with him. He is sacrificing other things in his life so that he could serve this man. This is mind-blowing for these people. Absolutely mind-blowing. And I think it's mind-blowing in our culture today. Because it's so easy for us to get up and I just need to get there. I need to go to that next thing. This is what I'm doing. This is my plan. This is where I'm going. And once I get there, then I can give. Then I can serve. Then I can do. Once I have these things, then I can focus on others. Then I can bless other people. This is not the case. See, our purpose is found in our proximity. So Jesus then asked the experts of the law. We'll go back to that. So, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And he goes on to say, the one who had mercy on him, which translates as compassion. The one who had compassion. Not the one that was the most religious, not the one that knew the most Bible, not the one that could look down at others, that had it all together, that was looked up to, that was respected. It was the one who had compassion. And he says, go and do likewise. If you want to have life, go and live your purpose of having compassion for others when there's need. Go and do likewise. Where am I at? Imagine your neighborhood like this. Imagine your workplace like this. Imagine our country like this. That when we trust God enough that we can live out our purpose no matter our circumstances. And that we don't have to get to the next thing or the right thing before doing so. That we get to look at every situation as one in which needs can be met. That we can actually see each and every person with inherent value that deserves compassion. I promise you that if you want a life worth living, there is need all around you that needs your purpose. Your proximity is found, or your purpose is found in your proximity. I'm going to wrap up with this story. David Mendoza, one of the leaders on our launch team, I asked him if I could share this story. We chatted about it yesterday. Back in January, one of the first things we did, and this is a whole nother spirit-dependent, other-centered, this idea of just, anyways, we wanted to just partner with Heaton Elementary. And how can we bless this school? How can we bless the students, the faculty, the parents, everything? So we started off on the foot of saying, we want to bless this school. So we did a teacher appreciation back in January where we brought in food, we got some kids, the toys for the kids, and just blessed them, just loved the teachers. And David shared a story there with the teachers, and just very uniquely, God is just so cool. David actually came to Heaton Elementary for a year or two, back in 5th, 6th grade, 4th grade, 2 to 3 years. He spent some time here at this school, which is just crazy. But David's story is that he spent time at numerous schools, that he spent time in a number of foster homes, that he spent time early on in juvie. And David lived a life that was very, very challenging, that was very, very hard, that was relatable to a lot of the stories here at Heaton Elementary School. And he shared with them the difference that a teacher made in his life. A teacher who he doesn't even remember the name of this teacher, but he remembers the impact that this teacher had on his life. And he told a story that, I can't remember if it was 5th or 6th grade, there was the camp, and kids get to go, and they take a week up at the camp, and everyone goes on it, but David, because of his behavior, was ruled ineligible for this trip. But what he didn't know is that this teacher wanted him on this trip. That his teacher valued David and wanted to see him participate in this joyful event, this thing that the students look to all year long. And David didn't know it at all, but the week leading up, this teacher was fighting for him with the administration, saying, I want him to go. I will take responsibility. I will watch him, all these things. David goes on to say that he ended up getting kicked out early and had to come home after a couple days. But David felt loved. David felt seen. David felt known. David felt cared for. Because what often happens is that in challenging situations, when we have things going on and we see projections of things, if we don't take the time to look behind the layers of why this is happening, we can't actually meet the needs. This teacher did that. A teacher here who had an incredibly busy life, who had a room full of kids, who had so much going on, who has worked to the wire, that he is on this journey, that he is doing this thing, but in the midst of that, he found purpose in his proximity. And his purpose was to have compassion on David. David goes on to say that this life continued for a while, this hardship challenge. David got to a point in his life that he didn't want to do it anymore. That he was done, that he was done with the hard things of life, the brokenness of a home, having different foster parents, so many things. He was done. And he remembers this moment. He was sitting and he felt like God met him there. And one of the things that God reminded him of was this 6th grade teacher. The sixth grade teacher who made a difference in his life. He doesn't even remember the name, but he remembers how he met his needs, that he saw him, that he valued him. See, this teacher got this, that his purpose was in his proximity. He didn't have to go overseas. He didn't have to go across the country. He didn't have to go and do a service project or an act of kindness. He literally looked around in what he was doing, and he had compassion on who he needed to have compassion with. We can all be that sixth grade teacher in everything that we do.